It's really wonderful to see all of you this afternoon. I know on our first official day of the conference and post-lunch, no less. So really excited to get to chat with all of you and explain the context of a bit of what we did in this program and then really dive into getting to know all of you and the spaces that you're at in your careers and thinking about teaching. So I'm Brandon Golub, and I'm an associate professor of teaching in criminology, law, and society at UCI. We'll share a little bit more about that in the context of the certificate program that we designed, but I really want our VIPs, of course, to have the opportunity to introduce themselves because we're really profiling their work and what they've achieved. So I'll turn it over to all of you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karma Rose Zavita, and I'm a sixth-year doctoral candidate at UC Irvine as well, and with all these colleagues.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christian Apolinar, and I am a fifth-year doctoral candidate at UCI, also in CLS.
Hello, my name is Clarissa Poonla. I'm a third-year doctoral student at UCI.
And my name is Gabriel Alvarez, and I am also a third-year doctoral student in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society.
Fantastic. So just by a show of hands, other doctoral students in the room from other spaces? Okay, the bulk of individuals, and then we have faculty and professionals in other spaces. I see some nods of the head. Fantastic. So wonderful. Welcome to our panel, which, as you know, is officially titled Training the Teachers of Tomorrow During Trying Times. And I just wanted to give you a bit of context, although we'll spend the bulk of our time hearing from our panelists of what really was the inspiration around this program and what we're continuing to do with it. So, as I noted, I'm an associate professor of teaching, which means I have the real pleasure of teaching a variety of different courses at UCI, close to 10 now from different spaces. So for example, I currently teach hate crimes. I always hear it when I say it. I don't actually teach hate crimes, right? No one's learning how to commit a hate crime. We're thinking really about the conceptualization and measurement of hate crime, and hopefully most importantly, how to counter it. And of course, thank you to our wonderful ASC president, Professor Jenis, not only for this amazing conference, but also because I've been lucky enough to be a co-designer with her on this course. She's really the reason that the course exists at UCI, and we continue to think about how these topics of our course are related to what we do in our program. And so, both from the more standard fare, I teach constitutional law next quarter, assuming it's not moved to the history department. We laugh, so we don't cry. And what we're really thinking about is any contemporary moment, any trying time, any socio-political shift, the wide variety of criminal law and justice topics that we all teach and study and interact with, from mass incarceration to policing to immigration. The reality is that we're experiencing those and they're unfolding in real time while we're teaching them in our classrooms. So that, of course, means we have unique challenges that we're encountering and working through, and across the courses that I've had the pleasure to work with, and then in consultation with my colleagues, have found time and again that often the questions we get from our outstanding graduate students and TAs who have been TAs both in those courses, elsewhere, instructors of record for their own courses, are how do we respond to student questions, concerns, ideas about these very pressing social issues that they're being impacted by, while we're also taking up this charge of being able to analytically understand them and unpack them in the classroom as well. So coupled alongside those questions and asking how do we collaboratively work through this together is what really gave birth to this certificate program, which we're going to get to hear a bit about the different pedagogical spaces that we've thought through, and we've thought across the lines of students having content knowledge and technical knowledge, but perhaps lacking some of that pedagogical knowledge or training. How can we fill that gap? And so we designed this certificate program, which is focused specifically on pedagogy and teaching training to address these issues, these topics in our criminology and law and society spaces. Our first cohort, which the wonderful individuals next to me were all part of and continue to be part of, was a group of 12 doctoral students. As you heard from their introduction, a major goal of this first cohort for us was to ensure that we were pulling students from all across different years within our PhD program and who had had different training. So we had within that group, which as noted, we have about a third of them here with us, students, and a couple others who are going to join us in the audience also, who were everything from their first year in the program. Erin was a first year in the program when she joined us, to 6+ years in the program as well. So we really had a range and a representation of where students were at in their doctoral career and continue to be at. And we also had a range in teaching experience, which is what we really wanted as well. We had everything from students who hadn't previously served as a TA yet to students who had served as a TA 8+ times, with the average really being right around 3 to 5 quarters, so at least had a full year or a year and a half of teaching experience across a variety of different courses. The cohort was split across, we had 2 years of training that they engaged in, and so the first year was the opportunity to have and go through workshops that already existed on campus. So we worked collectively to identify from our Division of Teaching Excellence elsewhere what training was already happening. We invited experts from those spaces to provide additional training for our students. We also did professional development training around teaching statements and other spaces as well, so that everybody got the same foundation around what they were doing, what they were thinking about, how to approach these topics. And then in the second year, which is the year that folks completed in spring, they all designed their own workshops around issues that they identified as there is a real gap in TA training in the space, and it would be very beneficial for us and for our colleagues to know how to tackle these topics and think about them in their own classrooms. And so that's going to be the bulk of what we're really looking at and thinking about. Now that they've successfully done that, we're in the space of using those materials that they created in order to keep those workshops going in a digital space so that future cohorts can join and be part of that. Did I leave anything out? I'm going to kick it off to my wonderful additional panelist, who really, though, was a co-designer of this program, a co-PI on the grant that we were lucky to receive from UCI's Office of Inclusive Excellence, which supported this work. And she'll share a bit more context, because I know people don't really want to hear from the faculty side, right? But specifically from the student side of why it was identified as a very important gap that could be filled.
Yeah, so I had TA'd for Brandon for a couple of quarters, and we often found ourselves just having long conversations about the needs of our students and responding to the content, the material, engaging with current events, and just the heaviness of our discipline and what we work with and what we teach. And part of the role that I serve within our school broadly, at the School of Social Ecology, is to train the incoming TAs for the next year. And in designing a lot of that training that I was guided to do through the Division of Teaching Excellence and Innovation, I found that students were getting a lot of technical knowledge, like here's the software, here's Canvas, here's how you should be formulating your emails, here's how you should be grading and addressing things in office hours. And we were giving them all these nuts and bolts of how, but we weren't engaging with them about any sort of pedagogical knowledge, right? And so there seemed to be a really big gap between the technical knowledge they were getting in a very general training for TAs and a pedagogical on the ground in the classroom type of training. And we know that students are going to get, the TAs are going to get content knowledge when they're actually working with faculty and are engaging in the readings with undergrads as well. So we wanted to design something that would be a space for me and all my colleagues to come together and have the same types of conversations that Brandon and I were having in a way that was more formal and really allowed us to collaborate and design something that would be long-term for the department and really support students who are interested in teaching. The ways in which this certificate is going to move forward will be a little bit more self-guided, and we'll be able to add a bunch more topics to the courses that we've been offering in the seminars, so it'll grow and expand. Long-term, we've also even considered how it would look to open to the campus wide, because we know that there are needs in other disciplines that overlap with ours, and that maybe some content is similar. And we know that this type of pedagogical support really supports students when they're on the job market and getting ready to be thinking about teaching in the department and beyond. So it has been really, really wonderful to work with all these colleagues and get to learn from them and with them as we design something that will be here for future years to come. We're going to move now into talking about some of the specific sessions that we had all worked on designing, and I will pass it on to Christian.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Christian, obviously, and I agree with Karma Rose, and that when we start as TAs, we are taught how to use Canvas, we are taught how to create modules, but a small portion of us are taught how to teach specifically controversial topics is what I did my workshop on. And what I have noticed as an undergrad that went to community college and then the CSU and now at UC is that there are different teaching methods that professors take when it comes to controversial topics. Some people prefer letting the students handle controversial topics, whereas some professors like kind of a free-for-all, but there's really little guidance and there's a lot of questions that a lot of TAs have since we're not formally trained in it. So that's what I found most helpful from this workshop. I'd like to pass that on to Clarissa.
Hello, my name's Clarissa, and Gabe and I both teamed up and did a workshop on how to teach in a trauma-informed manner. So we really focused on trauma-informed pedagogy. A lot of the topics that we study as criminologists are inherently traumatic, and it's one thing to not only learn about it, but how to expose our students to it. We have to be really mindful that our students come from all walks of life, and they might have experienced some form of whatever we're studying, and we have to really put not only their needs, but we have to keep them in the front of our minds when we are talking about such hard topics. So Gabe and I did one workshop, and one thing that we really focused on is doing content warnings, not only during class, but also in our syllabus, and really putting it out there so students know what topics we are going to talk about, so they can not only prepare themselves, but if at all they feel that they can't engage in such a topic, they could also have some opt-out options where they are still learning about the topic, but maybe they aren't gonna do the same reading as the class, or maybe if it's a video that they maybe think that isn't best for them to watch, there are other options to put out there. So that was one strategy that we felt would be important to take as educators to not only keep our classroom a safe environment for students, but just to make sure they know what they're going to be taught and they have the autonomy to choose if they can fully engage on certain topics or maybe not fully engage.
Yeah, so I think what our workshop was trying to accomplish just in two bare-bone goals was, one, to give a definition to those in criminology, law, and society about what is trauma and how is it experienced. I mean, because I think there's this kind of emphasis that trauma is very individual, and that can be, but what are the different types of ways that you can explore that? And so there's something where it's I stubbed my toe. Maybe that's not the best example, but I stubbed my toe. It's an individual experience. But then there's also collective trauma, for example, a mass shooting. But then you get to intergenerational trauma. Perhaps there was a war crime, especially what's happening in the Middle East right now. So when you think about subjects like that, it's how do we kind of define this area for people who are studying a discipline that these issues, they come up sporadically and they're constant throughout the way that we study crime. But more than that, I think it's also important to acknowledge that while this is hard to go through, students in this discipline and faculty alike, they need to be comfortable talking about uncomfortable. And I think especially in today's society, there's this kind of blurring of what's traumatic versus what's uncomfortable. And it's yeah, there's things that are traumatic, and there are ways and alternative ways to still learn, just like Clarissa was saying, with content warnings. But when you start taking something that's uncomfortable and then just not talking about it, that's when you're going to see a halt in change and real progress in criminal justice policy. And that's not what we want. As pedagogy, informed people, we really want our students to go beyond what we do. And in order for them to be successful, whether that goes into the academe or into the career field, we want to make sure that they're still talking about these issues that are uncomfortable, that are personal to these people, and that they're coming up with solutions to them. Yeah.
And just to add on to that, I think ours kind of paired really well with Christians because a lot of like the topics that we study are not only controversial, but they're traumatic. But one thing that I learned from Christians that I really would like to implement as I become an educator myself is that when we are talking about controversial topics, that there are some like classroom rules that everybody respects and make those well known at the beginning of the class. So even when we go into discussions that can be either like two-sided or people have very strong feelings about them, we still refer back to those, rules where we keep in mind that we need to be respectful towards our colleagues and students need to be respectful amongst themselves in discussion. But also one thing that I've kind of learned over the course of taking this certificate program and taking another class that was specific on pedagogy, but allowing those students to contribute to classroom rules so they don't feel like they just have to follow the classroom rules, but they're also actively sometimes making them together. And it could also be like a community building situation for some classrooms. So I think that was one strategy Christian went over in his workshop that I really appreciated.
Fantastic. Thank you for providing that additional context based off of your workshops. I really want to salute our students in terms of really doing this pivot and this deep dive into pedagogy literature across a variety of spaces in order to put forth a workshop that was really well informed, whether that was about trauma-informed pedagogy. As noted, we have a number of students who are presently on the panel with us who also dove into spaces such as teaching through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, such as mind-body trauma and how they worked through that in the somatic space as well. We had a really wonderful workshop from an audience member and fellow member of the cohort that was specifically about responding to hardships that students are going through outside of the class and how they bring that to the classroom space and how to negotiate that and being aware of campus resources to refer them to. So they really thought critically about what is already being offered, but also what else they could pull from evidence-based spaces in the pedagogy literature to offer their colleagues and themselves more knowledge in this space. So now that we have the context on the workshops, I'd like to take just a bit of a step back because I know that we have folks in the room who are, of course, interested in teaching and committing themselves to being successful teachers and educators by nature of being here. So a question that I have for all of you, and then we can do some more specialized, individualized questions, is given all the demands that are put on PhD students and you being pulled in different directions around research, dissertation, defense, why did you choose to commit yourself to increased teaching training, and what value added have you seen in it for your development? So do you want to kick us off, Kiara, and then we can...
I found myself being more excited about grading and engaging with students, albeit it could be very hard. And then I realized, I really want to teach. Research is an additive to my life, and yet where I really have the passion is in working with students. And I wanted to find more effective ways of doing that. That made it more comfortable for my students and more comfortable for me, and alleviated some of the tensions that we all experience in working with faculty as well. So how could I initiate some of the knowledge and expertise that I was looking for on my own? We are really, really privileged to have the Division of Teaching Excellence and Innovation on UCI's campus because they offer many workshops like this. And so I did a bunch of those and got really excited, but I realized that really we needed it within our department. We needed something that was specific to our students' needs, and the topics that we engage with. So I did this because I was having these types of conversations already, and it became just a more formal way of bringing together people who I knew were very clearly passionate and excited about teaching also.
Hello. So I decided to sign up because it does sound a little cheesy, but I wanted to contribute to the field, and I wanted to help educate the future leaders and future scholars in our field. And part of that, you do have to teach. And as I mentioned earlier, we are not formally taught how to teach. So when it comes to teaching criminology, you're going to be faced with challenges like, how do I teach the death penalty? How do I teach crime hotspots, 3 strikes laws? Sometimes students will want to argue with each other, and in part of my workshop, I mentioned, during week 1, you have to establish rules. It's good to act as a facilitator. So rather than pushing your own viewpoint, you can start with open-ended questions and lead the conversation from there. You can also take polls at the beginning of the class session to see where your class stands, and later on, as the course continues, you can begin to do little polls or check-ins to see if perceptions start to shift. But it's good to let civil discourse happen so people can learn from not only the instructor but from each other in a civil way.
Yeah, so similarly, I also really want to kind of have as many pedagogical strategies for not only when I TA'd, but eventually like teach a course myself. I, as an undergrad, felt like I didn't go to undergrad at UCI, but I felt like every class was just PowerPoints, lecture, do your readings, and maybe some discussion if there was time for that. And it got a little mundane for me. So I wanted to know if I felt this way. I'm sure other students felt this way, and I want to just expand the strategies that I know and could later implement into my own classes. So I kind of came in with knowing that I get a little bit bored of like the typical traditional lecture, and I just wanted to see what other strategies are out there that I can implement and try to get students' attention and also get students to collaborate more. I think that was a part of undergrad that I missed out on because of the traditional lecture that I was consistently getting. So yeah, I use this as an opportunity to expand the strategies I can collect in my toolbox for later.
Yeah, for me, it was because I actually started the program in my first year, and I think that timing was also pivotal in my decision making because, like Clarissa, I didn't do my undergrad at UCI. I was in Texas, and the criminal justice program that I was part of is pretty small. So the class sizes were also small. And so I felt like I had a really good experience with intimate class sizes, you know, a good professor-student ratio. And then I get to these bigger places, and I'm like, how do people get a word in? How are we supposed to learn? And if there's questions, they're probably not being asked because there's so many people. And I thought, if this PhD is supposed to develop me into an expert in this field, in research and all these other things, it should also be developing me on how to teach this subject. And so I thought that this was like a really cool way to learn with people, especially the multi-cohort model, where you're getting people who have already been doing some stuff versus people like me who was like, I've never taught my own course before or anything like that. But now coming out of the other end of it, I mean, I think it's just, it's been such a helpful tool that I think can be used at various levels, whether you be a graduate student or faculty, early career faculty for sure. I just think that it's something that being able to teach this subject, I really like that it's like about CLS pedagogy. Being able to teach this subject should be more accessible, and yeah.
Wonderful, thank you all. And as noted, over our next half hour or so, we can do some more specialized questions for individuals before we do ultimately want to save the time to offer up and hear from you in terms of any questions or thoughts that you have around implementing some of these practices that we've been talking about. So since we've always been getting to you last, Gabe, why don't you go ahead in terms of kicking us off, you're managing collaboration and how difficult it can be specifically around these divisive topics. So do you have an example of something that you've either seen implemented or something that you've chosen to do of an effective practice for collaboration around these tough topics?
So something that I've done in a, actually in a course that I taught over the summer is I had some discussion boards on something, and I said, pick the thing you like the least or you disagree with and support their argument. And we got some pretty interesting responses, and the whole point of that was to kind of get people to think or to put themselves in other people's shoes. Because I think when you start with conflict, if you don't have that ability to do that, it's going to be very hard to come to a civil agreement. And so I think that there's definitely more strategies that people can be doing in CLS to, instead of kind of more what I've seen is where it's just like, you're wrong, I'm right. And that sometimes that's faculty-led, sometimes that's more student classroom-led, but it is unique by class. So I think the things like that where you can get people out of their own heads and thinking like other people is what's been most effective when it came to combating kind of more hostile spaces, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gabe. And Karma Rose, I know you've had to tackle this a lot as well, as both a TA and an instructor of record. So what's a practice that you've done in your course space that you've found effective for promoting collaboration?
Yeah, so I have students doing something that I call labs. And that's when outside of the classroom, they take the content that we've learned and they go and do something with it. So for example, if we're learning about legal consciousness, legal knowledge, what have you, they'll go and interview people in their lives and take note and then code what it was that they learned and see how legal knowledge and legal consciousness shows up in the lives of the people that they have around them. Then we come to class together and we all talk about how different the people in their lives were with regards to what they knew and or their engagement, disengagement with law. So my practice has been to really connect what we do in the class to folks' lives, to give it meaning and actually have the gravitas that it has in other places, because so much of what I see students being told in some classrooms is that you're supposed to leave yourself at the door and come to class, empty your brain, and we're going to fill it up. And in the reality, our students have a significant amount of experiences and knowledges already, and if we're not utilizing that, starting from there and tapping into it, then we're really missing out on an opportunity to engage with them as people in our future careers and as future colleagues. So I've really tried to bridge the gap between the classroom and what they're doing in their lives.
This is great because both Karma Rose and Gabe gave us examples from courses where they served as instructors of record, but something that Clarissa hinted at in her opening remarks was the challenges, perhaps when structure is very predetermined based off of faculty that you're working with. And so in your opinion, based off of what you've seen, what you've encountered in both your classes as a TA and elsewhere, Clarissa, what has been effective for building an instructional team that's not this pre-designed format, but actually allows graduate students to be an active part of that process?
Yes, so for an instructional team, going in my first year, I started the certificate program as well, so I had no idea what a TA responsibility was besides our, the social ecology or like the larger school training, which is most of us mentioned is more technical and using Canvas, and this is how you could, like, examples of how to grade and all of that. So I wasn't too sure, like, what I was getting myself into with other TAs and a faculty member, and through, I think I've TA'd now 8 quarters, I think one of the key themes to have an effective instructional team is communication. Regarding that, I've just had not the best experiences TAing when there's a lack of communication, and then there's also a lack of like the roles of a TA and the roles of the instructor. When those aren't very clear from the beginning of the class, I think there are a lot of challenges ahead. But when the roles of what the TA should be doing and the deadlines for grading and the amount of feedback that should be given to students, when that's very clear from the start of the class or even like a week before meeting with the other TAs and instructors, I think that's when the effectiveness is at its highest, because there's no room for ambiguity and there's no room for, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to do this in time. So I think a key thing for effective instructional teams is starting the communication even before the class begins, and keeping that going throughout. So I really enjoy when instructional teams have just like check-in meetings, whether that's like 20 minutes, and I've TA'd with a few instructors that have those consistently, and I really appreciate that because it's not only a time to like reflect on how the course is going, but it's also a time to just get to know each other. I know we all kind of like talk in professional settings, but that's kind of a less formal, like, oh, how are you doing? And it kind of builds community, which I really appreciate.
If I could add to that,
Please.
I think something that Clarissa is sort of hinting at that I've really seen all of the students in this program do is, because we have challenged ourselves and gained so much pedagogical knowledge, we're now pushing faculty right? We are initiating these conversations and asking for more clarity and helping to design the rubrics and other things that aren't being designed. And we're making the entire department stronger as a result of it, it feels and it seems, while making the experience as TAs and educators ourselves a lot more seamless and easy to it's just been a really great process to see it actually then be implemented into the classrooms and the teaching teams that we have.
Awesome. So if we expand that out to think a bit about what faculty does, what you intend to do as future faculty in training more generally, I know we have what we specifically did in our certificate program, but I'll ask Christian and then we can open it up. What types of, I know this was a broad type of training that we did over 2 years, right? So what types of more micro or smaller practices or training have you found helpful? I know you've seen a lot of different types of teaching teams over your 5 years, and what would be your core push for takeaway around what works for a teaching team?
Yeah, so I would like to add on to what Clarissa was saying, that communication is key. What I find most helpful is a little bit of flexibility with the professor being a TA, kind of just saying like, hey, is it okay if we work together? We can help design the course. My first quarter at UCI, I worked with a professor that did teach on the death penalty, and he was open to experimental teaching because it can be a controversial topic. And what we ended up doing was putting students in groups of 9, and these 9 students would act as if they were Supreme Court, and they would be assigned cases relating to real-life death penalty cases, and they would be asked to collaborate. And as you can imagine, they're not always going to see eye to eye, so they did engage in civil discourse, and then for their assignment, they would be asked to write, like a Supreme Court draft, and some concur, some dissent, and at the end, they can write a little reflection of saying like, are there any perspectives that you feel like were not mentioned? Were the readings biased? So that way they can still have their voice whether they agree or not with what was going on in the actual case and what their group outcome was. So I think that experimental design with professors is very helpful.
Wonderful, and I know we've also been talking a bit big picture in terms of course design. So if we zero in, wanted to give everybody a core takeaway practice. We talked about collaborating. A number of you mentioned soliciting feedback from students in terms of setting the ground rules. So I'd like to think about that as a concrete example in terms of, some said, even before the class starts, or how do we invite student voices in? So what are the different ways that you've seen that done, or you've actually seen that put into practice, whether it's called, right, across the literature, we've seen it called an honor code, we've seen it, a dialogue code, rules perhaps around language, which we could debate, or the ways that people engage. So what is like a concrete practice in terms of how you've seen that done? How do you actually solicit that input or feedback from students?
I guess something that I've done, because before I started graduate school, I actually worked in the industry a little bit. And kind of to Karma Rose's point earlier, I think a good honor code and a good system that's going to be effective is one that you tie to their lives. And so you might be saying like, hey, we're going to let people finish their points. If you have things that you want to say, why don't you write that down and bring it up at a time when there's space to do so? Kind of take space, give space. Because the professional workforce is just like that. And you're not going to have, let's say, the flexibility, because, like as Christian was saying earlier, sometimes professors let the students have at it. That's probably not going to happen at an agency that you're working for. And so you really need to be prepared to have civil discussion and to abide by some type of rules that are beneficial for everybody. And I think touching on that last point is also important. Why do we have these things? It's to support and to better the conversation and the learning that you're doing under our instruction.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think, as I kind of previously said earlier, was like allowing the students to not only contribute to those, because if you just have a group of students and you're like, these are the rules of my classroom, they don't really have a choice but to abide by them because those are your rules that you've created. And if they have a problem with it, they probably take it up with you personally. But I think not only allowing students to contribute to those rules, not only kind of gives them a voice in the matter, but it also kind of builds that community, like, okay, we're all agreeing on these, and maybe if there's a disagreement, we can have like a civil discussion of like why one rule should be this way versus the other. But that was one thing that I really liked, was it kind of gives them the voice and they have a say on how the class is going to go for the quarter, and it's just not going into a classroom and this is how it's going to be. It kind of gives them the autonomy they deserve.
So for me, one way that I like to receive feedback is through reflection essays. As I mentioned, sometimes students do feel a little heated afterwards. And you know, for those that have gone to therapy, sometimes the therapist is gonna say, if you are feeling anxious or angry, the best thing to do is write it out. So after talking about a controversial topic, some people are introverts, they don't like to say stuff out loud, but they're obviously thinking something inside and they feel unpleasant, discomfort. So giving that reflection essay gives them time to write out their thoughts. And as part of the assignment, you can also ask, like, are there any questions? Or you can just simply ask for feedback at the end of the essay. That way, they get to vent. They get, aside from learning different perspectives, and you get to personally know what each student is feeling.
Awesome. Thank you for zeroing in on some concrete spaces to think about student feedback, student buy-in, student involvement. That gets us to a really important aspect of our program, which was promoting inclusion more generally in our classroom spaces, and we know that there can be a number of challenges around that. We could talk about the specific identities of any of our student populations, the students that make up our populations, and thinking about how you do that across a space where, for example, in our school, over half of our students are first generation, over half of our students are Hispanic and Latinx identifying, and every other identity that you could think about. So I'd love for AR to kick us off, and then others, of course, who would like to contribute as well, to help us think about how you think about inclusion more broadly in your classroom. And you talked already a bit about not being able to expect students to leave what's in their mind or empty their demographic or experiential diversity at the door. So what does that actually look like in terms of the concrete design of the course or the practices that you undertake?
Yeah, so one thing that I really try to do if I am totally prepared and in an ideal world can do this the week before, 2 weeks before the course, is to send out a pre-course survey. And in that, it's an anonymous, voluntary survey, and I'm asking about their lives. Are you working? What year are you? Are you a transfer student? What's your commute like? Are you a parent? Do you have access to X, Y, Z? And that informs me as an instructor on changes that I might need to make if I'm able in those last couple of weeks before the term. And then when we come to class in that first week, part of what we do in that first class is, yes, sort of set community guidelines, go through the syllabus, but we also whip out all the results and we talk about who's in our space. We talk about who's represented, who's here, who's not here, what that looks like, what that means. We have conversations about what the conversations will look like with who's in the room. And I think it's really helped students to feel not alone, right? To actually see that there are students who are working, there are students who are parents, there are students who have large commutes, et cetera, who have different identities than they do. It's been a very simple practice to create a more inclusive space, but pedagogically, it allows me to make changes that I really need to make that become then more inclusive, if that makes sense. So I'll leave that there for the simplicity of it.
Awesome.
So I agree with Karma Rose. It's always good to know who's in your space and get a feel of, the perceptions of the class or very early on in the quarter. So one thing that I like to do is just do something like poll everywhere very early on, and plan the discussions that you plan to have in the course with these students in mind. You have to respect their spaces. Some demographics experience more hate crimes or situations than others, so it's always good to be very, very mindful and prepare for any rebuttals, any type of naysayer when you're giving these presentations in class. So always prepare ahead. That's what I like to do.
One strategy that I've noticed as a TA that some instructors give is for like a final project, instead of saying, oh, like, let's write a final paper and submit it, is they give a variety of options that students can take. So whether that be, I've even seen just like a painting or drawing and give a reflection of how that how that intertwines with the class material, or a presentation where you record yourself talking about a certain topic, or if they do choose to do that paper, they could do that. But giving students options creates a really inclusive environment for not only students to tap into something that they may not have had the opportunity to do in a classroom setting, but also if that's something that feels more comfortable to them, they can choose that option for themselves. So that gives options not only for maybe a final project, but other assignments throughout the course where there's different routes students can take to accomplish an assignment.
I just want to echo that, yeah. If I had to say, like, the answer to, like, how do you do inclusion, I would say options. And Clarissa touched on some ways that you can do that. I mean, in my own course, I didn't have a final exam. I had a final topic paper on any week of their choosing. They had to either create and illustrate a storybook that incorporated some of the readings that we were doing throughout the quarter, and then they also had the option of doing a podcast. I think there's so many different options that people can come up with to achieve the same goals. Just because it's not necessarily a final exam where you're doing multiple choice tests does not make the achievement of learning less present. You can do this in multiple different ways. And I think options also kind of expands to beyond actual coursework, but also availability of the instructor. I mean, I know I've been a part of some classes where I was a student and then also TA'd where some professors have like mandatory check-ins for students. I get the goal of that. You know, you want to make sure that students are heard, but maybe they don't, like maybe they're working, they can't meet these mandatory things. But having options of like, okay, there's office hours, and then there's also kind of something that I'm putting into practice when I start to teach an in-person class is an informal check-in survey. So it'll be a live link on the Canvas that basically you can fill out like a Google form to say like, hey, I would like a check-in that's different. It may not even be related to the course, but it's something there, it's a space, and it's available for those who may be more hesitant to go to a formal office hour, or if they can't make it because of transportation reasons or scheduling conflicts. It's a space where they get to kind of set the terms based off of an allotted time on availability on the instructor's part. But I think having options communicates care. And when students feel cared about, I think is when they start to engage more with the content.
I also think, just to add on one more point to that, is that giving the options, I think, is a win-win, because I think as a TA, it's a really pleasant experience not to have to grade 100+ essays, but if I'm able to watch or listen to podcasts or watch some presentations, the variety also helps get the grading done a little bit smoother. So I do feel like giving options helps both the students and the TAs who are going to grade it.
Wonderful. A number of you mentioned different components related to both inclusion but also technology. And as we're on this precipice of instructional modalities being reimagined in a lot of different ways, I know you've all seen a lot of different iterations and examples of effective uses of technology, less effective uses of technology, purely online courses, hybrid courses, in-person courses, probably all these other modalities I don't even fully know, courses that you Zoom into from Netflix while you're cuddled with your dog on the couch, everything that you can possibly imagine in some capacity. So I'd love to hear a bit more. We can start with Clarissa, because I know you just mentioned podcasts, but in thinking about different modalities for that, but an effective use of technology that you've seen, whether that's for specifically asking about students' spaces that they come from for inclusion, or, as you noted, just creating a more inclusive classroom because of access and the way that they can showcase their knowledge around cognitive diversity.
Yeah, I think kind of just going back to technology broadly, the amount of students that we get so many diverse variety of students. Sometimes we get students that are a little bit on the older side where they aren't familiar with technology, and I've had students come to me and be like, I haven't used a Google form before, how do I do this? So one thing that I have done in the past was just have a specific office hours dedicated to like any technical questions. Like if you don't know how to find a peer-reviewed article, like I'm willing to take time to just show you the things that you can do and how to use technology that's going to help you in any academic setting. So I think also never assuming students know these technologies, because I think that was a mistake I made as a TA. My first quarter was like, oh, I'm going to send out this Google form, and some students didn't know that they need to be logged in with their UCI email. So I kind of had that assumption, not realizing that was an assumption on my part, where I needed to, okay, let me take a step back. What are we familiar with? And going from there and kind of starting from ground zero and just making sure that all students know how to use Canvas even. I've had some office hours where I've just walked students through Canvas and how to get to the different modules. And I've got a lot of good feedback on that. So I think just talking about technology broadly is never assume students know how to use the technology, even Canvas that we use at UCI, especially. That's like the main thing that we use. So I think that was one thing I personally learned, but also just going into other ways that technology can be used. I really like telling students to, like, maybe sometimes if they're stuck writing, voice memo your thoughts. That's something that's really helped me when I feel like I have writer's block, but I can talk it out. Or even recording a conversation with a colleague about the topic, and if you can't get it out on, when you're typing or when you're writing, I'm sure you could speak it out. So that's one other way that I've kind of told students to incorporate technology, just to get simple tasks done, but that might feel difficult.
Fantastic. Other successful or less successful implementations of technology that folks have witnessed or put forth? Christian?
I can go, yeah. So there's one that's really hit or miss with students, and that's Perusal. For those that don't know, Perusal is an application that you can tie into Canvas, and it allows all students in the class to access a specific reading, and they can all annotate it together, and you can see what everyone else is writing. So the good thing about this is that there's a lot of jargon used in research articles that a lot of students are not familiar with. So having students annotate it and reading what their peers are writing is a helpful way to help students understand what the reading is about. But also it provides a lot of different social lenses. People come from all walks of life, as we've mentioned before, and it's good to have some people mention sociological, criminological, psychological, all over the academic world. So it's good to see everyone contributing and learning not only from us but from each other. But as Clarissa mentioned, sometimes there are struggles because in order for it to work through Canvas, they do have to be logged into your UCI or your institution email. So yeah, that's.
Can I add to that? I've used Perusal very successfully in an online asynchronous class where students can sometimes feel really disconnected from one another. And one way that you can kind of bring down the focus and make it a little more intimate is to make groups within the app. And so then you're like working with the same group, or you can change them every week, and that's been really effective. Another thing that I've done to enhance the depth of content and comments is to give them guided questions to engage with the readings, and or give all of the different groups different questions. So give one group a focus on what are the methodologies, what are the findings, what tests did they run. Give another group the sort of theoretical frames and things like that. And then they all come together in class having already had this knowledge, and they can share it out. So there's a bunch of ways that you can utilize the Perusal tool. Students don't often love it at first because of the technological challenges. So I just made videos and had them online showing them how to use it, how to access it, how to log in, and then that's there forever, and I can just sort of utilize that for future classes. But making it accessible is really important because students don't want that to be a barrier to being engaged.
Wow, you all have clearly gone above and beyond as we explored in our gift certificate. Everything. You can see where my head's at, right? Yeah, everyone gets their gift certificate afterwards. As we explored in our certificate workshop, of course, also, and we led off with this panel of asking about all the demands on our PhD students and our faculty, right? And now we see in some of these conversations as well, in terms of promoting inclusion, ways that you've taken up tech support, ways that you've taken up social work support. So of course, right, it really takes us back to this fundamental question of being aware of our university resources, what that means, what we're able to actually provide, drawing those lines as well. I know we're going to get to some questions in the audience, but since this is ultimately a profile of you and your work, I wanted you all to share briefly about future career goals. I know you shared where you're at in terms of how this certificate program fits into that, but one of the aspects that I enjoyed most from our Google form when people were applying to the certificate program was we asked, are you interested in a career, an academic career that could be teaching focused? And we had folks who signed up for the certificate program that said, no, that's not their primary interest or goal. And we had folks who said, yes, absolutely, and everywhere in between. So now, on the other side of the 2 years of these experiences, not that we ever know fully, do you mind sharing briefly about intended goals, how this situates itself within it? And we can start with Gabe on the end, because I know that we often go in order this way.
It's fine. My goals are to find an academic job in a department that's interdisciplinary, because I think that's kind of where the best learning happens. And I do want to be somebody who's creating courses that students take that they really, it's not just for a semester, it's something they take with them into their careers and for the rest of their lives. I really hope to be a bridge from knowledge into praxis. And it's super exciting. I mean, something that I've taken from this certificate right now is like, I'm gonna be teaching a course in the spring at another institution, a course that I get to design on family violence. And I'm super excited to kind of use these skills and this knowledge now to actually come up with things that are going to engage these people versus just a lecture-based course where it's like maybe super dry. I really want people to come away from these classes with an experience and not just the head knowledge.
Personally for me, I haven't taught or I haven't instructed a course myself yet, so I think a short-term goal is to do that. And then I do think a long-term goal is to be teaching focused. I feel like that's where a lot of my passion is, and being able to connect with students is one thing I find really, really important. I also went to undergrad at a CSU where the classroom sizes are a lot smaller than a UC, so I think that was a culture shock to me. But I do think kind of being at an institution where it's easier for the instructor to have like more one-on-one conversations or more in tune conversations, and you don't have to worry about like 100 students in the room and like making sure everybody's engaged. That would be a personal goal of mine.
I mentioned very early on in the presentation that one of my goals was to go back into academia to teach because I wanted to contribute to my field and help build up the next generation of scholars. And that stands, and I agree with Clarissa that I think that smaller class sizes where students are more engaged and professors are able to better understand their students is ideal, and that's what I plan to do in the future, near future.
Yeah, similar to my colleagues, I plan to teach, and I am also open to positions within the teaching community, like instructional designing. I've had a lot of opportunities this year to facilitate pedagogy workshops, and I've had a lot of fun doing that. So anything that allows me to teach, work with people in this space, I'm open to.
Thank you for sharing that. And I know I have tons more questions for them. They're like, how could you still have questions even if we've been working together several years? But I wanted to do a temperature check with our audience and see if there are folks who have something that they would either like to share or that they've thought about, either that they would like to offer up to our panel or specifically about the certificate program. We do have a microphone in the middle of the room, which I know also feels intimidating at first, but from wherever you would potentially like to ask your question, I can always repeat it back for accessibility purposes. And if folks don't have questions, I'm happy to continue down our line of what we were thinking about. Thank you, Sophia. Clearly also one of our, this wasn't a plant. I know we talked about gift certificates. I was like, Sophia, the gift certificate, right? We appreciate you being here and sharing.
Yes, can you hear me? All right. Also a UCI student, so mostly a question for Gabe and Clarissa, the trauma-informed teaching specialists. But I've noticed, and it's not a a novel observation, certainly in criminology, but that a lot of the criminogenic factors that we study are also, risk factors for victimization and also adaptations to experiences of trauma. So I'm curious, in teaching those topics and concepts, especially to undergrads who may not have had previous exposure to knowledge in those areas, how are you conscious of the way in which those overlap, and especially in shaping people's understandings of how victimization and trauma and perpetration of violence sort of all develop in similar ways and in different overlapping circumstances?
This hits close to home for the victimologists in the room. But I think one of the best ways you can do that, because it's true, I mean, looking at my own life, before I entered higher education, like Christian, I went to community college, I was homeschooled my entire life. And so when I came into college, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much to learn and to know, and not all of it's good for me. So I think some of the ways that people should be going about it moving forward, and it's a way that I'm, in the course that I'm developing on family violence, where that's especially present, is definitely kind of what Karma Rose was suggesting. I'm glad she mentioned that earlier, was get a survey, a pre-course survey, especially for topics where you're teaching like family violence and where there's like victimization of various kinds, various implications, because it can be shocking. Like 1 minute you're taking Intro to Criminal Justice, the next minute you're taking homicide as a class, and two different ways of approaching those types of pedagogical subjects. But I think future criminology and socio-legal studies departments should definitely be more transparent with getting to know their student makeup, because it really is. I mean, on a quarter system especially, I like at UCI, but most are on semester, the classes change. You're not, what you got, if you just did like one survey, like, oh, this is how I'm going to be doing it for the rest of the time, you're missing it. Because like we've been saying kind of most of this panel, all students are coming from different walks of life. They can't really leave themselves at the door. So how are you going to lay a foundation where there's going to be more growth than harm?
I think adding on to that, one thing that I had appreciated in the past is not only just when I'm signing up for courses, but when I'm registering for them and when the instructor puts out the syllabus really in advance, like as soon as possible, because in, like you were saying, teaching topics of victimization, of violence, all of these things are inherently traumatic, and if somebody isn't in the mental state where they can take all of that information in, I think it's important that they're able to see the syllabus for themselves, have some time to decide if they're able to take the course, because unlike like an intro to CLS or intro to criminology, that kind of touches on the main foundations. Some topics like family violence, as Gabe was saying, they're really intense, and I think if the students have time to look through the syllabus and time to drop before the drop deadline and all of that, I think that's really important to give students the option, okay, maybe this course isn't for me, let me find something else.
Fantastic, and I'm happy to bring us back to just one or two more topics that I have a lot of interest in, and I know that our panelists have, in terms of what we've explored and we've heard from our audience while questions continue to brew. And if they don't, we can all go have a collective cup of coffee together or whatnot. I wanted us to think about a very important topic that has to do with just acknowledging contemporary topics in general, something we tackled in our certificate program that we thought about, and it's not as if we're on the heels of major events or shifts that may be hard or appropriate or inappropriate. There aren't direct answers in terms of how we come through literature of acknowledging contemporary events, whether faculty should feel compelled to, how they do that, how they tackle that. I know everybody makes their individual choice. So I'd love to hear from you all. I know many of you are teaching this quarter in terms of picking any event. It could be this quarter or a different one. Outcomes of the election, whether or not that's something that goes acknowledged in your classroom space, whether it's important to acknowledge it, and how you do that in an objective, inclusive way.
I'll start with that, because I actually did get a couple emails about things, so this is like very relevant this quarter.
This is exactly what I was thinking. At students, right? In student support hours,
Right.
let's say, I'm in shambles.
And
What do I do? Not that we can address every individual issue.
right, and I think that's what you have to keep in mind. I mean, I certainly, as an educator, and this is my own perspective, am not one who's going to necessarily comment on someone's perspective so much as being a resource for somebody who might be going through a difficult time resulting from that crisis. I mean, elections, one of many different type of things that could happen on a macro level that students could have their emotions kind of, in a flare-up about. And so whether that is like harm or joyous, to be the case, I think it's the duty of the instructor to be available. And so if there is something that happens, like this last election, I think as an instructor, sending out an email just saying like, hey, we're transparent. We know that maybe not everybody's happy with this, or maybe because majority of the time these things are things that people aren't happy about. But you're sending out an email, you're acknowledging like, hey, there is a space if you would like to come talk about this issue with me. And I kind of see this as removed from the course, but in ways, at least in CLS, like this particular topic is not. But I think it's, the main point, I think, is really just to be available and to have that, because, I mean, you might be it. And I think that's kind of more of the point, where you might be the only kind of space for somebody to discuss what they're feeling and how they're going to resolve that conflict within themselves. So, I mean, and other people may disagree with me personally, but for me, I'm more of like, I will be a space for you to discuss how you're going to get through that versus assert my own opinion into that space.
I think it's always really important to acknowledge that students are going through things, whether or not an instructor is going to explicitly talk about what's going on or make it a class dialogue, but to acknowledge the tenor, the feeling of everything, I think is super key. I tend in my classes in the beginning of the class to say, look, I know these things are going on, we will get to them, but I choose to hold them until the end of the session, because if we start with some of the current events in a lot of times, in a lot of spaces, it can be difficult to work with students to stay in the space and hold space for all of that. And so I usually hold it off to the last 20 minutes of the class, and then what I really try to do strategically is how can we connect what's happening to what we just learned the whole class. And the times that I'm effectively able to do that, it also helps students to process and work through it, or providing a historical context for something that we're going through to really let students see that, we will get through it, et cetera. This is a current phenomenon. Here's a historical context, and here's how it relates to what we're taking up in class. But for me, it's more important, in my experience, about the timing of when I do it and how I do it.
For me, I think it's important to acknowledge important situations or current events, but how you handle that really depends on your class. No one is going to know your class better than you. So whether you want to address it in the classroom as a whole or as an announcement is up to you. I think that's your decision to make based on how you're reading the room. But regardless, I think it's important to provide resources and tell the students that you are there to listen to them. Sometimes they do, as previously mentioned, they need someone to talk to, and you are going to be their space.
If I can extend, I would love to hear from you. I think there's no one better than you in terms of bringing in popular culture and current events into your classroom sort of as a practice, right? So something that Dr. Golub does consistently allows then when something does come up to be natural, right? Students are already expecting that. Would you share a little bit more about how you do that and your approach?
That's thoughtful, but did you have anything to add, Clarissa, before we...
I think I agree with everybody on the panel. Just like definitely acknowledging it. I can't imagine not doing so because it is such a pressing topic right now, especially with the election. I also think maybe sending out a poll, getting a temperature check. I know personally I was so mentally checked out that like yesterday I had a class that I was zoomed into, and a lot of people felt similarly, that we almost use it as just like a processing space. So I think once you kind of get whatever the results of that poll is, you could maybe adjust taking it a little lighter that class, or maybe, yeah, seeing if people do feel the need to talk about it, maybe reserving more time than you would have then assumed students would need or want. So I do think maybe adjusting maybe the plan for the day in that class according to like how students are feeling. Yeah, it's really hard when tough topics are this, and they're everywhere, they're unavoidable. So it is really important not only to acknowledge it and provide a space to process, but also just what are the feelings today? Is today a day where like nobody's gonna focus? So if we do like have a short lecture, is anything gonna really be taken in? And if people are saying they really aren't in the headspace, maybe you could adjust class accordingly.
And may I just add that it's also important for professors, aside from acknowledging that there is a current event affecting students, that it can also impact participation. So if there is a major event, whether it's on campus, in the state, or just national level, just be mindful that if you see students turning in late assignments or turning in no assignments and start to recognize a pattern, you might want to consider changing how you grade or at least provide extensions. So just be mindful of that.
This is really fantastic, and I know that Karma Rose kicked the question back to me, literally turned the microphone toward me. So not to be on the spot, but I mean, will probably come as no surprise that regardless of the course that I teach, the first thing I do is embarrass myself in some capacity, not intentionally, but tripping on stage or some type of a flub that really just sets the tone of we're all humans and are going to be collectively negotiating these topics that we're going to have differences of opinion about, and they're going to disproportionately impact us, and we're all going to say the wrong thing at some point in time, and we're all going to make mistakes, and we're on the same team, and we're in this collective space of negotiating that together, whatever that may potentially look at. I know that Karma Rose hinted at the use of humor, which I know that a lot of folks ascribe to, in a capacity to think about what it means to tackle these very complicated, difficult topics in a way that also allows for some amount of levity and space to breathe. I think, of course, that will also look different across modalities and identities and how we feel comfortable showing up to classrooms for a variety of different reasons, and can look different across instructional modalities as well. The things that you may do in an online space, of course, would look different than you would potentially do in a human space where you're being recorded. Everybody's like, is this going to end up on YouTube in some capacity? And I think the important aspect, as noted, is really just recognizing that there is a space for it, that students feel comfortable around broaching it in some capacity in terms of how you're carving that out, and then tying it back to the course material and the content, because there's always going to be an opportunity to do that. An outstanding teaching assistant from one of my courses, who also may have been the person who was generous enough to offer up a question, right, really jumped in that online space to recognize in that hate crimes course, there were a lot of questions from students around how outcome of the election may be correlated with increased hate or bias-motivated violence, and sort of tie it back to, here's X concept that we already touched on that really speaks to this contemporary event, can be very fruitful. And just by chance in this online course, the two case studies that the students were already tackling were related to witch hunts and lynching. So the narrative somewhat wrote itself in terms of histories of misogyny and anti-Black racism, then leading to this point of, do we really need to comment on the election results? Or are you able to read the room and the historical analogs and think about potential outcomes? So the key takeaway being creating that space of engaged and thoughtful and respectful learning, whether or not you ascribe to what safe spaces look like, and whether or not that is a practice that people put into space, and letting students know that we're all negotiating that collectively in a variety of different ways. So I'll just leave us with, because I would love to hear, we've tackled such complicated, hard topics. You've really showed how you've gone above and beyond, not just in our pedagogy program, but also in terms of all the roles you've taken on for students. What is your one quick top line of what you do for self-care amidst all this? We haven't talked enough about how do we protect ourselves. We talk a lot about wellness in the classroom. We explore wellness in the classroom. But what is something that you do for your self-preservation while thinking about your future career as well? Small question, right?
I took up baking.
Baking, all right, great.
I like to go on hikes, and that's very peaceful. And I set aside time where I'm just like off any form of technology, especially with like we were talking about the election and like seeing headlines and everything is like unavoidable. It is avoidable when you just like don't touch technology. So just setting a little bit time aside. I know being grad students, it's like feels impossible to like not be on your email or on your phone. But even if it's like 30 minutes, it could be the most refreshing 30 minutes.
I agree about those 30 minutes. I spend much of my life behind a desk staring at a computer. So for me, I like to self-center myself and just go outside, feel the breeze, breathe in the air, you know. It's very refreshing and self-centering, so that's what I do. Just like to go on walks.
I like to do something with my hands, garden, embroidery, organizing something, cooking, what have you.
Awesome, so the very tactile,
Yeah.
the baking, the nature, or the tech detoxes, whatever they may
And
potentially be.
Netflix. You can multitask.
And Netflix. I imagine anything else that you would like to share or, of course, dialogue about will, of course, be around, and we would love to have those conversations with you. I want to thank you all, of course, for taking the time to be here to learn about our certificate program, but really, most importantly, to learn about the stellar work that these folks are doing, which are the reason that I love my job. So huge round of applause for them and all of you.
Big thank you to Brandon.